Hi, my name is Robert Rapier. I'm a chemical engineer in the energy business. I've worked in the energy industry for more than 20 years and many different roles in alternative energy and in fossil fuels, oil and gas, alternatives of all kinds. I write about energy. I'm very passionate about sustainability and about energy issues. I have lived and worked in several different countries, including Scotland, the Netherlands, and Germany. I've worked all over the U.S. on energy, and so I'm very happy to be a part of your project. Thank you.
Realistically speaking, and in your opinion, how would a green energy transition look like? And what should be the role played by three actors: governments, corporations or companies, and self reliant communities?
A green energy transition to really be successful is going to have to be smooth for consumers. We use fossil fuels because they're cheap and they're readily available and they're convenient for people. And they don't think a whole lot about the externalities, and so that's what we have. Now, if they had a better option, a cheaper option, I don't think they'll necessarily pay a lot more money to go green. So that is where the role of governments will come in. Governments need to tilt the playing field whenever they can. And that can be through higher taxes. It could be through different sorts of taxes. It could be, one way is to shift maybe higher fossil fuel taxes for lower income taxes. So I think there are ways that governments can encourage a transition to a greener energy economy. Companies, of course, have to be there and be responsive. And as governments do tilt the playing field, there are lots of companies that should be there available and able, as they were in the U.S., which is in the U.S., we tilted the playing field toward ethanol, toward corn ethanol. And there are lots of companies there that formed and got together, and they made a lot of corn ethanol. And so we ramped up a corn ethanol industry in the U.S. very, very rapidly. And so that is what it can look like. It can happen rapidly if there are enough government incentives there. But the downside of the corn ethanol story is we didn't displace a whole lot of oil. We use about as much oil as we did before because it takes a lot of fossil fuels to produce corn ethanol. So that's another story entirely. Self-reliant communities, they can definitely serve as a model. And there are countries that are more self-reliant than others, and we can look to those countries as a model. A country like Iceland gets a lot of power from geothermal, and how that might look. There's a lot of geothermal resources out there. Countries that get a lot of wind power, like Denmark, that get a high percentage, high proportion. There are a lot of models around the world, and we need to look to them, and we need to look to self-reliant communities, and they'll tell us a lot about what problems are encountered and how they manage to solve them.
Why does the global demand for crude oil continue to climb? And at the same time, what are the external factors influencing the fact that the price of oil continues to fall? And how do these two trends interact?
So, interesting statistic. Over the past 30 years, oil demand has grown by 30 million barrels a day. And it's been almost a continuous climb of about a million barrels a day. And despite all of the warnings about climate change, despite all the concerns about oil consumption, oil continues to grow. And the reason it continues to grow is because it offers people a convenience of mobility that they can't get anywhere else. And so what you've seen in recent years, over the past 10 years or so, developing countries, oil consumption in developing countries has actually surpassed that of developed countries. And $100 oil, for example, flattened off demand growth in Western Europe and in the EU and in the United States and in the developed economies of the world, while it barely had any dent at all in demand growth in Asia Pacific and China, India, and across the developing world. And the reason for that is you have a whole lot of people whose quality of life can be made better by consuming just a little more oil. This occurred to me in an epiphany about 5-6 years ago. I was in India, and I saw 7 people all riding on a moped. And I said, those people, the oil consumption that they use is very, very small, but it gives them great mobility now. And so you've got, more than 1 billion people in China, 1 billion people in India, all of them using just a little bit more oil, and it adds up to a lot more demand. And so that's what's driving demand growth right now. Now, the reason oil prices are falling is because the shale oil boom, the hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling boom that started in the U.S. about 10 years ago, put about 5 million barrels a day of oil on the market that wasn't really expected to be on the market. And this eventually started to impact prices in 2014. The prices started to soften. And OPEC then made a move. They decided they weren't going to cut production to balance the markets. At that time, the markets had gotten about a 2 million barrel a day excess capacity. And OPEC decided they were going to defend market share. And so at their November 2014 meeting, they came out and said, we're not going to cut production. And they actually increased production. And so you've got all the shale oil production in the U.S. and all the production from OPEC. OPEC increased production by nearly 2 million barrels a day since then. And there's a lot of oversupply on the market right now. And these factors combine to collapse the price of oil. And what that ultimately does, it crushes investment in future oil production. Not only that, it crushes production in alternative fuels. Some alternative fuels may be competitive at $80 and $90 oil. They don't look so good with oil at $30. So, it would be good for alternative fuels if governments could set some kind of maybe price floor for oil so that alternative energy companies are not competing with $30 oil. Maybe they're competing with something like $50 oil. And that can be done, again, through some sorts of taxes where you have in Europe, where you have oil prices for the consumer artificially high, and as a result, you have a lot more fuel-efficient vehicles, and you have a lot more mass transit, and you have biofuels and so forth. Those are the kind of policies that globally would help a lot in a transition to a green energy economy. How do these trends interact? Well, the main thing is the collapse in the price of oil collapses investment, which ultimately causes production shortfalls, and that causes the price to skyrocket. So this is the boom-bust cycle of oil. It plays havoc with oil producers. As we see right now, a lot of oil producers going bankrupt, but it plays this exact same sort of havoc with biofuel producers.
With reference to the just mentioned trends, do you perceive them to be more as an obstacle to this green energy transition? And if yes, what would be the measures that should be put in place to smoothen this transition?
Yes, and I answered this a little bit in the previous question, but in the previous video clip. But the problem for alternative energy producers is the problem for energy producers in general. These projects take a number of years to complete. And without some sort of certainty, developers are slower and more hesitant to develop projects. So here in the U.S., we've had wind energy and solar energy credits. Also in Germany, of course, lots of countries have had feed-in tariffs and so forth. So governments have done things to try to provide some certainty to renewable energy producers. And that takes away some of the uncertainty of the oil boom and bust cycles. Of course, the problem is governments can take that away, as we saw in Spain, where Spain had very generous subsidies, and they took those away, and it caused a lot of financial hardship for a lot of companies there. So, there's no certainty that policies will stay in place. But the best we can do is have progressive thinking governments who will try to pass policies and get the wind and solar projects in Spain, particularly solar, they're not going away. But all the money that's invested has sort of dried up there. But we need to try to encourage that around the world. That'll happen naturally as fossil fuels deplete and they get more expensive. But we shouldn't wait until that happens. We need to go ahead and have governments do what they can to speed up that transition.